Hey everyone! Today's story is about a stressful job that starts the moment you're born, becoming an Egyptian pharaoh. While other babies cry and burp, you're wrapped in ceremonial linen, examined by priests, and declared Horus on earth. Before we get started, be sure to like the video and subscribe if you really enjoy this kind of storytelling. And let me know in the comments what time it is for you. I'd love to see who's joining us around the globe. So turn down the lights, turn on the gentle sound of the fan, and lie down. This is boring history for sleep, where even the divine babies don't get any rest. Your birth is accompanied by omens, stars are observed. Sacred cows may or may not moo in your honor. Somewhere, a man with a shaved head and too much eyeliner is already carving your name into a stone tablet you'll never read. From your first breath, everyone around you is panicking. Not because you're fragile, but because you're the next living god. Which means if you so much as cough, the court astrologer might declare a national crisis. Childhood. Not happening. You don't get toys. You get ceremonial scepters you're not allowed to chew on. You don't get lullabies. You get hymns written in your honor and chanted by elderly priests who smell like frankincense and regret. Your crib is likely a gold-plated structure that's colder than the February. You are surrounded by a team of caretakers whose job is to prevent you from dying, disappointing the gods, or doing anything undignified, like crawling. You are bottle-fed political expectations. Your first words are probably scripted, and if you try to play with your cousin, someone whispers, "He's fourth in line, best keep an eye on him." Even before you can walk, you're being groomed to rule. Royal advisors are already plotting your education, your image, and probably your eventual spouse, who, spoiler alert, will share your last name and your jawline.
And let's not forget, you're being raised to believe you are divine. Now, that's not a metaphor. You are expected to internalize from a young age that the sun rises for you, which is adorable until you realize the entire kingdom will blame you if it doesn't. If you thought being born a living god came with perks like skipping school or spending your mornings feeding ducks by the Nile, think again. As a young pharaoh in training, your schedule makes modern CEOs look underemployed. Your day starts early, like stars still out, priests already chanting early. You're woken not by a gentle nanny, but by a steward holding a golden tablet detailing today's responsibilities. And no, take a nap isn't on it. First lesson, reading and writing hieroglyphs. These are not normal letters. They're tiny pictures of birds, eyes, and upside-down bread loaves that somehow form entire government policies. One wrong doodle and you've accidentally sentenced someone to eternal torment. Then there's religious instruction. You're quizzed on the sacred names of gods, the proper way to bless a cucumber, and how many times to blink during an offering. If you mess up, a priest frowns at you like you just sneezed on Ra himself. You also study math, not to do taxes, but to build monuments. You're taught geometry, not for fun, but because one day someone will ask you how to stack 2.3 million limestone blocks into a perfect triangle without accidentally inventing a leaning pyramid. Oh, and don't forget public speaking. You'll have to give speeches to crowds that think you control the weather. There's no winging it when your words might be interpreted as divine instruction. Say the wrong thing and suddenly grain prices crash. Military strategy is next. You're 10.
You've never even thrown a rock in anger, but now you're expected to know battlefield formations, river crossing techniques, and how to casually mention smite the Nubians. Philosophy, you don't get that. Instead, you're taught how to maintain Mayat, the sacred cosmic balance, which sounds poetic until you realize it means making sure crops grow. Criminals don't rebel, and nobody insults the gods during flood season. All of this happens under the watchful eyes of tutors who are equal parts teachers, informants, and walking anxiety attacks. By the end of the day, your head is full of symbols, schedules, sacred laws, and just enough political paranoia to keep you up at night. In most childhoods, your friends are the kids who share snacks or toys and a mutual desire to avoid homework. But when you're the future pharaoh, your friends are more like potential enemies wrapped in linen tunics. Every child you interact with is a political variable. that cheerful boy who races you through the palace gardens. He's the high priest's son, the one who always wins at board games, nephew of a general and the girl you actually like talking to, already betrothed to your cousin for dynastic stability. You're not surrounded by friends. You're surrounded by people with titles, bloodlines, and very nervous-looking parents. Everyone plays nice, but only because you're considered sacred, and their careers depend on your favor. That's not friendship, that's networking. Even your tutors report back on your behavior. Did you show signs of independence? Excellent. And also threatening. Did you question the rituals? Not excellent, and possibly heretical. Did you ask if your cousin could stop staring at you during lunch? Alarming, and definitely going in the scroll. Privacy doesn't exist. You can't sneak away for fun because fun is suspicious. If you disappear for 10 minutes, someone alerts the palace guard. You're divine after all, and the divine must not wander off unattended like a common farmer's goat. And heaven help you if you show favoritism. Invite one child to play Sune, and 3 others write angry letters in pictograms. Say something kind to a noble's daughter, and suddenly there's a rumor you've chosen your queen at age 9. So what do? You become guarded, polite, politically neutral. You master the art of laughing without meaning it, and complimenting tunics you secretly hate. You learn to make every friendship seem equal, because if someone feels slighted, their family might conspire against you during breakfast. This is the royal version of no new friends, not because you don't want them, but because any one of them might grow up to be your assassin, your rival, or worse, your brother-in-law. By now you're not just a prince, you are officially divine. Not royalty divine, an actual God on earth divine. The priests confirm it, the scrolls say it, and the people bow like you personally invented sunlight, which sounds impressive, until you realize nobody asked if you were ready for that kind of pressure. Every time you sneeze, someone declares it a message from the heavens. Every step you take is ritualized, and every mistake you make must be carefully explained in a way that doesn't imply the gods are clumsy or forgetful. But here's the kicker. While everyone calls you Horace on Earth, you still stub your toe, still get pimples, and still get stomach aches from too many figs. Divine? Maybe, but not immune to bad digestion. The contradiction is staggering. You're taught you're all-powerful, yet you can't leave the palace without 5 guards, 3 priests, and a chariot procession. You supposedly control the floods of the Nile, but if you trip over a cat, someone starts whispering about bad omens. You're also expected to maintain Mayat, the divine balance of the cosmos. It sounds poetic, and until you realize it means you're personally blamed if there's a drought, a riot, or a mildly disappointing harvest. And of course there are rituals, constant, exhausting rituals. You must speak in special divine phrases. You eat sanctified food. You participate in ceremonies where you have to pretend to defeat evil using props and heavy golden objects while sweating in a linen tunic. Privately, you might feel doubt, maybe even boredom, but you can't say that because saying, "I'm not sure I'm a god," is the fastest way to cause a theological meltdown or get replaced by a cousin who is sure. So you smile, you bless statues, you wave from balconies, and you quietly wonder how many gods before you also secretly hated this job. Because here's the truth. Being a god wasn't liberating. It was a full-time performance with eternal consequences. You were expected to be perfect, mystical, and celestial. Even on days when all you really wanted was to eat a pomegranate in peace. And no one warns you that the higher they place you, the lonelier it gets at the top of Mount Divine expectation. So puberty has arrived, your voice cracks, your body's changing, and just when things couldn't get more awkward, your advisors slide in with a scroll and a smile announcing, it's time to choose a wife, preferably your sister. Yes, your sister, in the noble tradition of keeping the bloodline pure, a term that here means genetically risky. You're now expected to marry a close relative, your aunt, your half-sister, your cousin, all perfectly acceptable options according to dynastic politics and 0 genetic counselors. Romance, irrelevant, personal preference, not part of the ceremony, This is about optics. You're divine, she's divine. And nothing screams divine legitimacy like holding hands at your wedding with someone who also shared your wet nurse. Meanwhile, the palace is buzzing. Court officials are debating which relative is the least related, like it's a riddle from the gods. The priests are thrilled. The bloodline stays heavenly. The servants are placing bets. You're just trying to pretend this is normal, but it gets better. Because it's not just about marriage, it's about heirs. Fast, you're barely past your first chin hair, and already there's pressure to produce a mini pharaoh to keep the line going. No pressure. Kid, just all of Egypt counting on your awkward teenage hormones. And while all this is happening, you're expected to remain calm, composed, and ceremonial. Because you're not just a husband, you're a symbol of order, fertility, and divine cosmic power, especially during rituals where you're paraded with your new bride, who, to remind you again, may also be your niece in private. You might feel disgust, confusion, or just the overwhelming need to flee into the desert and scream into a sand dune. But expressing that would make you look unstable, so instead, you nod, you smile, you attend the banquet, you marry your sister, and you convince yourself that it's for the good of the realm, because what's a little inbreeding when the fate of Egypt depends on you producing a suitably godlike heir who may or may not have 3 elbows? This is royal puberty, sponsored by genetics, politics, and denial. And the only thing more twisted than the family tree is pretending it's all completely divine. You've finally been crowned, Pharaoh. Time to enjoy the glory. Right, not quite. First, they glue a fake beard to your chin with beeswax and strap a cobra to your forehead. Congratulations, you now look like a very anxious
statue with back pain. Let's talk about the crown. It's not a nice, lightweight royal accessory. It's solid, often dual-layered headpiece made of leather, linen, and sometimes actual metal. You're wearing symbolism, heavy, sweaty symbolism.
And you have to stand for hours while wearing it, in the sun, while priests chant things in your ear about the universe depending on your posture. The double crown is the real star here. It combines the red crown of Lower Egypt with the white crown of Upper Egypt, signifying that you rule everything, which is beautiful in and terrible for your neck. It feels like balancing 2 helmets and a houseplant on your skull. Then come the ceremonial outfits, long white kilts, leopard skin sashes, golden breastplates, all made to impress the gods and overwhelm your joints. Linen clings in all the wrong places, gold doesn't breathe, and you're not allowed to fidget, even if a bug crawls up your shin. And sandals, forget comfort, they're decorative. They're basically papyrus flip-flops that offer no arch support and remind you constantly that style in ancient Egypt came before circulation. But none of this is optional. You must look divine. Not comfortable on a chariot divine. Sculpted into eternal godhood divine. Even if you're sweating buckets, chafing in gold, and desperately trying not to faint into the Nile. Every outfit you wear, every color you choose, every feather sticking awkwardly from your headdress has cosmic implications. The wrong symbol could offend a god. The wrong color could signal political instability. The wrong hemline could accidentally summon a famine. No pressure. You are now part of a centuries-old fashion statement made for the gods, not for flexibility or airflow, and the only thing more exhausting than ruling Egypt is doing it while wearing 30 pounds of spiritual pageantry and pretending none of it itches. Your throne may be made of gold, but it's not ergonomic, and the only thing heavier than the crown on your head is the expectation that you wear it like you enjoy it. Being Pharaoh came with unlimited power and unlimited blame. You were worshipped as a living god. Sure. But the moment something went wrong, the entire kingdom looked straight at you like you'd personally unplugged the Nile. Too much rain. Clearly. Pharaoh is unbalanced. Not enough rain. The gods must be punishing Pharaoh. Crops failing. Well, that's your fault too. And if someone stubbed their toe on a temple step, well, that's probably because you angered Bastet by sneezing the wrong way during last week's ritual. You were the head of state, head of religion, and head of maintenance. If the sun didn't rise properly, people didn't assume bad weather, they assumed you forgot to pray hard enough. You had one job, keep the universe running smoothly. You also had no idea how to actually do that. And because of your divine status, you couldn't admit ignorance. I don't know why there's a plague of frogs wasn't a valid response. You had to either pretend you had a plan or make up a ritual on the spot and act like you meant to do it all along. Even your dreams were public property. If you had a bad dream, your court astrologers would gather, scribble furiously, and probably declare that a new temple needed to be built immediately to protect Egypt from your subconscious. Got a headache? That's a national omen. Woke up late. An official scribe notes it down as a possible sign of apocalyptic imbalance. One sneeze too many and a goat gets sacrificed just to be safe. And if things really went downhill, famine, uprising, plague, sandstorm, crocodile incident, the people didn't say, "Wow, nature is wild." They said, "Pharaoh must be weak or worse. Maybe the gods want a new pharaoh." So you walk around draped in gold, surrounded by incense and flanked by bodyguards, all while quietly wondering if your citizens are building a new statue or digging a new tomb. The role of Pharaoh wasn't just ruling the land, it was absorbing the blame for every mosquito bite, muddy riverbank, or undercooked sacrificial goose. Because when you're divine, there's no such thing as a simple mistake. It was never just your job to lead, it was your job to be perfect and take the fall. When the universe hiccuped, being Pharaoh meant early mornings. Your wake-up call wasn't gentle. It involved ritual chants, burning incense, and a group of heavily perfumed priests quietly judging your posture. A normal person might start their day with coffee. You start by being ritually purified with water from a sacred pool that's probably colder than the afterlife. Then, it's straight into wardrobe, not for fun, but because your linen had to be blessed, pre-folded, and likely ironed with moonlight, or something equally dramatic. You're barely awake, but you're already wearing 30 layers and a chest plate shaped like a falcon. Next, the ritual cycle begins. You enter the temple, a priest unrolls a scroll the length of a crocodile. You're expected to perform sacred gestures in perfect sequence. Hand here, nod there, smirk at the statue, chant the name of a god you haven't studied since childhood. Forget making a mistake, one wrong syllable, and suddenly you're being blamed for the Nile drying up, the cattle dying, or the moon not looking divine enough. Everything had to be done perfectly to maintain Mayat, the sacred balance of the universe, which for some reason was apparently hanging on your ability to wave incense correctly. The rituals weren't short either. Some ceremonies took hours, and you couldn't yawn, you couldn't slouch, you definitely couldn't say, "Hey, do we really need to rub sacred oil on all 43 statues today?" This wasn't just religious duty, it was national theatre. Priests performed, scribes recorded, onlookers nodded in grim spiritual approval. Meanwhile, you stood in stiff silence, pretending you didn't have a cramp in your god leg. And all this happened before you did anything resembling ruling the kingdom. So yes, you were the most powerful person in Egypt, but your mornings were dictated by astrology, bird omens, and a ceremonial checklist that made modern tax forms look fun. By the time the sun actually rose, you were already exhausted and still had 12 more rituals, 3 public appearances, and 1 carefully scripted divine smile to go. As Pharaoh, you were the most powerful figure in the kingdom, and that meant every single person around you was either pretending to love you or calculating how to replace you. Your guards, loyal, yes, until someone offered them enough gold, goats, or spiritual favors. Your advisors, always smiling, always nodding, always accidentally reminding you that your cousin is very popular with the military. Even your cupbearer was suspiciously enthusiastic about bringing you drinks, like he wanted you to notice how not poisoned they were.
And let's not forget your extended royal family, a tangled mess of half-brothers, uncles, and people named Ramesses, who definitely wanted your sandals. These weren't relatives, these were succession applicants. Every hallway conversation could be an ambush. Every banquet a potential Last Supper. You couldn't relax in your own palace without wondering if the decorative cobra on your chair was decorative enough. The paranoia was justified. Assassinations were practically an Egyptian sport. If you died suddenly, it was often described as a divine mystery, which really meant someone got creative with date wine and scorpion venom. So you developed habits. You had food tasters, you rotated servants, you changed your daily routine at random, not because it helped, but because at least it made betrayal slightly inconvenient. And sleep, good luck.
You rested in a guarded room with triple locked doors, a ceremonial dagger under your pillow, and a guard you only half trusted standing at the entrance practicing his best. I didn't do it, it's a face. But the most exhausting part wasn't avoiding death. It was pretending you didn't know it was coming. You had to stay calm, divine, and unbothered, because showing fear meant weakness, and weakness meant opportunity. Every glance, every handshake, every well-timed compliment could be part of someone's rise to your throne. And if you made the mistake of trusting the wrong person, well, you didn't have to worry about politics anymore. Being Pharaoh wasn't about ruling, it was about surviving in a palace full of people who bowed during the day and sharpened knives at night. As Pharaoh, you were expected to be many things: divine, wise, unshakably composed, and incredibly photogenic in 40-degree heat while wearing a gold chest plate and a smile that didn't suggest imminent collapse. Egyptian public life was built around ceremony, long elaborate processions through streets packed with people who loved you, feared you, or just came for the free bread. You stood in chariots, waving like a deity on parade, while secretly wondering if passing out was considered a bad omen. The outfits didn't help. You were decked out in elaborate robes, glinting jewelry, symbolic scepters, and a ceremonial headdress that trapped heat like a portable oven. Your linen stuck to places linen should never touch, and your sandals squished like they were stuffed with soggy papyrus. You'd stand through hours of rituals, blessing sacred cows, cutting ceremonial ribbons with a gold knife naturally, and accepting offerings you didn't want from nobles you didn't trust. You smiled, nodded, and occasionally muttered, "May the gods bless you," while quietly dying inside. The sun. It didn't care you were a god. It beat down like a divine judgment.
Your makeup ran, your incense choked you.
And yet, every eye in the crowd was watching, expecting to see perfection, not heat stroke in a leopard skin sash. And if you did falter, if you looked tired or annoyed, or, gods forbid, slightly human, the rumors would start. Pharaoh is displeased. Pharaoh is weak. The heavens are shaking. You miss one ceremonial goose blessing and suddenly people are whispering about drought. Even the festivals, which sound like fun, were just more work. You had to attend banquets where you couldn't eat, dances where you couldn't move, and religious plays where you played yourself and still didn't get a speaking part. It wasn't celebration, it was theatre, and you were the main actor every single time. At the end of the day, you limped back to the palace, drenched in sweat and divinity, wondering how many more statues you had to bless before the gods finally granted you a nap. Being Pharaoh in public meant constantly pretending you were having a spiritually profound time while slowly roasting like a ceremonial duck on display. On the surface, you were Pharaoh, Horus on earth, Lord of the two lands, divine ruler of all things Nile adjacent. But behind that glittering facade stood an even more powerful force, the priests. You see, the temples weren't just for praying, they were banks, farms, schools, libraries, tax offices, and, in all likelihood, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of data centers. The priesthood controlled grain, land, gold, public opinion, and metaphysical guilt, which meant that while you wore the crown, they held the ledgers. Every temple was a kingdom within your kingdom, and its high priest was its CEO. But these weren't harmless old men humming hymns. They were political tacticians in robes, fluent in astrology, bookkeeping, and subtle blackmail. They managed the gods, the festivals, the omens, and, more importantly, your public image. If you sneezed on a feast day, they could interpret it as divine disapproval. If you wore the wrong color sash, that might mean Ra was sad. And suddenly the Bali riots start. And yet you had to work with them. Without the priests, your divinity could vanish overnight. All it took was one new prophecy carved into a temple wall. And poof, the gods have chosen another. Worse. The temples were tax-exempt. They hoarded wealth with holy immunity. Meanwhile, your treasury struggled to stay full unless you started a war, sold grain, or shook down a merchant caravan. The priests, they had golden statues of jackals with better retirement plans than your military generals. But the worst part, they pretended to serve you, Pharaoh. We live only to uphold your divine will, they'd say, while quietly diverting resources, were managing spies, and advising your enemies to try prayer, and also treason. You were the figurehead, the sunlit symbol, the living God, and they were the committee that decided how godly you were allowed to be this week. Mess with the temples and the nation rebels, obey the temples and you slowly become their mascot. It was a power struggle with incense and passive aggression. And the longer you reigned, the more you realized the gods might live in the heavens, but their accountants definitely lived at Karnak. In most families, drama means someone forgot a birthday or made a snide comment at dinner. In yours, it meant conspiracy, palace coups, and the occasional accidental crocodile pit incident, because as Pharaoh, your biggest threat wasn't some foreign army, it was your own bloodline. You were raised in a palace full of siblings and cousins, uncles, and half-uncles, who all believed they should be sitting on your throne. Some were ambitious and some were delusional. All of them were dangerous. A succession, that was a nightmare. Egypt didn't have a firstborn gets everything rule. It was more like whoever survives the most assassination attempts and secures priestly approval wins. Half the court spent their time trying to guess which of your sons might become the next pharaoh, and the other half tried to make sure it wasn't the wrong one. Your own children were groomed like racehorses. Each had factions, tutors, spies, and mothers whispering bedtime stories about how the gods always choose the most handsome heir. Subtle. Meanwhile, your brothers and uncles weren't content with being royal background characters. Every one of them had at least one general on speed dial, and a disturbing familiarity with accidental staircase tumbles. And of course there were the queens. Yes, plural. You had multiple wives, often all living under the same roof, forming alliances and rivalries with the precision of political chess masters.
One wrong glance at the wrong royal woman, and suddenly the kitchen staff is quietly replacing your wine taster. Palace life was like living in a really beautiful, overly perfumed cage where everyone was either your relative or your future usurper. And funerals, oh, the drama. Every death became a suspicious death. Every illness, a potential poisoning. Every coughing fit, a topic of temple gossip. Even your own burial wasn't safe. Tombs were looted, names were erased. And your own loyal son might finish your pyramid and then immediately start carving over your legacy because he wanted a bigger one. Being Pharaoh meant that the people who knew you best were also the people who most wanted you. Removed, politely, permanently. It was a royal forest full of snakes. So, after a life of rituals, paranoia, heat stroke and family backstabbing, you finally die. You'd think you'd earned a break. But no, in Egypt, being dead didn't mean being done.
It just meant you were about to become a full-time spiritual symbol and a part-time horror movie prop. The embalming process begins immediately. Your internal organs are removed, weighed, and politely stuffed into canopic jars, each one guarded by a funereal, animal-headed deity, like a post-mortem Pokemon team. Your brain pulled out through your nose with a hook. Not because it's useless, but because tradition says so. Then you're stuffed with resin-soaked linens and natron salts until you resemble a sacred raisin in a very fancy bandage. Your body becomes a political relic, wrapped tighter than your palace tax scrolls. Next comes the coffin, or rather, coffins, plural. You're stuffed into a series of increasingly ornate wooden boxes like some kind of divine nesting doll, each covered in gold leaf, inscriptions, and protective spells in case you encounter rude ghosts on your way to the afterlife. But the real showstopper, the tomb. You've spent half your life and half the kingdom's GDP constructing a mausoleum designed to scream immortality. Walls covered in instructions, prayers, and awkwardly drawn images of you smiting enemies who definitely aren't going to bother you in the afterlife. Unfortunately, your tomb also screams, "Please rob me." Despite curses, guards, and architectural misdirection, most pharaohs' tombs were looted within decades, sometimes hours, of being sealed. So while your priests were chanting prayers over your eternal spirit, local criminals were sprinting off with your gold-plated footrest. But the worst part, if your name is forgotten, if your tomb is defaced, or if your mummified body ends up in a museum gift shop 3000 years later, you don't get to enjoy the afterlife at all. That's right. One bureaucratic oversight, and you're stuck haunting some poor archaeologist forever. You might have been king in life, but in death, your museum bait, political currency, or a cautionary tale carved into limestone. And just think, you haven't even reached the judgment hall yet. For someone marketed as a divine being, you sure spent a lot of time in mortal danger. Being pharaoh wasn't just about building temples and posing for statues. No, it also meant leading armies personally, as in grab your war chariot, strap on a bronze sword, and go smite some foreigners before breakfast. Your generals made the plans, the scribes wrote the propaganda, but you had to show up and pretend you weren't terrified, because divine authority only worked if people saw you physically leading the charge, even if you had absolutely no idea how to hold a spear without looking like you were trying to pick up laundry, and forget hiding in a tent like some medieval king. You were expected to ride at the front of the formation, waving a ceremonial axe and shouting your divine catchphrase, usually something like, "The gods will crush you," while silently hoping the enemy didn't have better archers this year. Even if the battle went well, you couldn't win quietly. You had to return home with prisoners, loot, and enough severed hands to impress the temple accountants, all of which would be paraded through the streets while you smiled and tried to look both humble and terrifying. Lose the battle? Though that's a problem, a big one, because pharaohs don't lose. If you got injured, humiliated, or, gods forbid, run away, the priests might interpret it as divine displeasure, or worse, an excuse to replace you with someone who hasn't been cursed by defeat. So now you're stuck in a cycle. Raise taxes to fund a war. Fight the war to protect your image. Then build a monument to exaggerate the war in case people noticed you nearly died.
It's expensive, exhausting, and extremely bad for your blood pressure. And here's the kicker. Even if you didn't want to fight, you often had no choice. Generals demanded it, advisors insisted. The gods sent a dream, or maybe the priest just ran out of things to do and decided it was smiting season again. You weren't just pharaoh, you were the marketing department for national military ambition. And if you didn't win, you'd better hope they bury you fast. Because history isn't kind to divine war heroes who come home without trophies. After all the rituals, warfare, backstabbing siblings, and linen-wrapped paranoia, you'd think history would at least give you a standing ovation. But no, the final insult of being pharaoh was this. Your legacy was entirely out of your hands. You could commission the grandest temple, carve your name on every obelisk, and bury yourself beneath a mountain of gold. But all it took was one jealous successor with a chisel, and poof, you never existed. You.
Name erased. Statues defaced. Achievements reassigned to your great-nephew who ruled for 6 minutes and declared himself son of the sun and also super cool. Erasing names wasn't just pettiness, it was spiritual murder. In ancient Egypt, if no one spoke your name, your soul couldn't reach the afterlife. Which means you weren't just forgotten. You were trapped in cosmic limbo because your great-grandson wanted your pyramid budget. And even if they didn't erase you, they might just rewrite you. Suddenly, your disastrous battle becomes a glorious victory. Your mild-mannered personality upgraded to unquestionably heroic. That embarrassing crocodile incident omitted entirely. Future generations treated your legacy like a group project that they didn't read the notes for. You were remembered not as who you were, but as what made the next guy look better. And for some pharaohs, the real humiliation came thousands of years later, when their carefully guarded tombs were discovered by archaeologists who immediately cracked them open, put their mummies under fluorescent lighting, and shipped their fingernails to museums. That gold sarcophagus you spent your life preparing. It's now a display case for elementary school field trips. Your royal toenail clippings are tagged, catalogued, and possibly available in the gift shop as keychains. You ruled empires. You were a god. And now you're a skeleton in a climate-controlled box, while tourists mispronounce your name and wonder if your curses are still active. So yes, you were the living embodiment of divine order, the chosen of Ra, the Lord of the Two Lands, and your greatest reward, being slightly misrepresented by a travel blogger 3000 years later. Harold Sigurdsson entered the world in the year 1015, screaming, we assume, into a kingdom already on fire. Norway was a battleground. His half-brother, Olaf Haraldsson, was fighting tooth and axe to unify the country under one crown. It wasn't going well. The nobles hated Olaf, the Danes wanted his head, and the old pagan traditions were cracking under the weight of Christian kingship. So baby Harold was born not into a cradle of comfort, but into a world of sword points, shifting alliances, and blood feuds. His family wasn't ordinary either. His father, Sigurdsson, was a minor king, more farmer than warrior, but wealthy and respected. His mother, Oster Gudbrandsdatter, was the political firestarter of the family, ambitious, shrewd, and fiercely Christian. And most importantly, she was the mother of Olaf Haraldsson, soon to be Saint Olaf. That made Harold a prince by blood and destiny, and a younger brother who would grow up watching a warrior king try to claw a country into unity from the beginning. Harold wasn't treated like a child who might one day do something important. He was trained like a future chess piece in a game that was already bloody. By age 10, he could handle a sword. By 11, he knew how to ride. And by 15, he was riding into battle? Yeah, 15. That was the year Olaf lost his throne to Danish invaders and returned from exile in 1030 to reclaim it. He gathered a ragged army of loyalists and marched to his doom at the Battle of Stiklestad. And guess who rode with him? Harold. Just 15 years old, Harold rode beside his legendary brother into the teeth of a superior army. No war paint, no glorious armor, just a teenager in chainmail, with too much idealism and not enough fear. The battle was a disaster. Olaf was killed, Harold, wounded and probably in shock, was forced to flee into the mountains with the scraps of the army. And from that moment on, Harold would never be a child again. He would be a fugitive, a survivor, and a man shaped by defeat. The Viking prince had entered the stage, not in glory, but in blood and retreat. This was not the end of Harold's story. It was just the prologue. After Stiklestad, Harold didn't disappear. He retreated, wounded and grieving. He fled eastward, crossing the snowy spine of Scandinavia into the wide rivers and dark forests of Kevin Rus. To most Norwegians, that meant exile. But to Harold, it was a second chance. At the time, to Kevin Rus was a rising powerhouse, Slavic, Norse, Byzantine-influenced, and ruled by Jaroslav the Wise. Lucky for Harold, Jaroslav had a soft spot for well-connected Viking royalty. Even luckier, Jaroslav's court was already crawling with Norse mercenaries. Harold fit right in. But this wasn't some cushy guest spot in a royal palace. Harold signed up to fight, and fight he did, against raiders. Steppe nomads, rebellious princes. Harold earned his scars and his silver. He impressed Jaroslav so much that he was given command of troops barely a year after arriving. He also may have fallen in love with one of Jaroslav's daughters, but we'll get back to that. The young Viking's reputation grew. He was tall, fierce, and clever with tactics, while most warriors charged headlong into battle. Harold flanked, feinted, and waited for his moment to strike. If you were under his command, you learned discipline. If you faced him, you learned regret. By now, Harold had matured into something far more dangerous than a desperate teenage prince. He was an operator, a warlord in exile, with no throne, no homeland, and no master. But Russ's wasn't where Harold planned to end his days. It was a forge shaping the iron. He wanted more. And so, in the late 1030s, Harold turned his gaze southward to Constantinople. It was the richest city on earth, guarded by walls taller than most mountains back home, and filled with gold, politics, and endless war. The Byzantine emperor needed soldiers. Harold needed a kingdom. A deal was waiting, so he left Yaroslav's court and travelled to the city the Norse called Miklagard, the great city. He wasn't going as a pilgrim. He was going to join the most elite mercenary unit of the medieval world, the Varangian Guard. This wasn't just a career move, it was an invasion of the Byzantine Empire from the inside. And Harold was about to become one of the most feared swords in their arsenal. When Harold reached Constantinople in the early 1040s, he entered a world that made even the wealthiest Viking jarls look like peasants. The great city gleamed with domes, mosaics, silk, and secrets. This was the beating heart of the Byzantine Empire. And Harold wanted a piece of it. He joined the Varangian Guard, an elite unit made up mostly of Norse and Anglo-Saxon mercenaries. Their job, guard the emperor, fight his wars, and keep a very sharp axe handy in case things got political. Harold wasn't just another brute with a beard. He rose fast. His height, his cunning, and the sheer ferocity of his fighting style turned heads. He didn't just survive in Byzantium, he thrived. Over the next few years, Harold Hardrada became a living storm. He fought in Sicily against Arab rebels. He battled pirates in the Aegean. He marched through Anatolia, crossed into the Holy Land, and even reached as far as Jerusalem, where, legend says, he bathed in the River Jordan and made a vow to someday rule a kingdom of his own. But Harold wasn't just swinging a sword, he was watching, learning, plotting. Byzantine politics were a viper pit. Courtiers, generals, and eunuchs all stabbing each other in the back with a smile. And while Harold couldn't out-scheme the palace elite, he could outlast them. He was there during multiple emperor swaps, civil unrest, and shady palace coups. And through it all, he kept rising. He also got very, very rich. Spoils of war, bribes, gifts. Some say he even stashed treasure in Constantinople to collect later. He wore silk, not fur, gold, not bronze. This wasn't the Viking boy who fled Stiklestad. This was a seasoned warrior with more Byzantine polish than most Greek courtiers. But Harold was never going to be content guarding someone else's throne, and when the emperor began to see him as a threat, just another ambitious foreigner with too much gold and too many friends, Harold decided it was time to leave. He escaped Byzantium the way he'd survived everything else, with a combination of nerve, muscle, and sheer Viking stubbornness. He'd spent nearly a decade fighting for emperors. Now he would fight for himself. His next stop, home, Norway. And this time, he wasn't coming back to beg, he was coming back to rule. By 1045, Harold Hardrada was done being anyone's hired sword. He returned to Scandinavia, a battle-hardened warlord, glittering with Byzantine gold, trailing exotic mercenaries, and carrying enough battlefield experience to make most kings look like amateurs. But Norway wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet. At the time, Norway already had a king, Magnus the Good, the illegitimate son of Harold's half-brother, Saint Olaf. Magnus had been holding the throne reasonably well. He was young, popular, and had united both Norway and Denmark under his rule. But what he didn't have was Harold's experience, Harold's wealth, or Harold's ambition. So Harold did what any self-respecting Viking power player would do. He hired an army. Using his Byzantine treasure hoard, Harold recruited fighters from across Russes and Sweden. Then he struck a deal with Svein Estridsson, Magnus's rival in Denmark. Harald would help Svein reclaim Denmark, and, in return, Svein would help Harald challenge Magnus for Norway. It was a messy, medieval bromance based entirely on mutual hatred and longboats. But Harald didn't actually need to invade. Magnus, sensing a bloody civil war in the making, made a surprising move. He offered to share the throne with Harald. It was a power-sharing deal that was never meant to last. The two co-ruled Norway with all the tension of a forced marriage between a peaceable king and a returning war machine. It was like trying to split a crown between a monk and a lion, and Harald wasn't the monk. In 1047, just 2 years into their uneasy arrangement, Magnus died suddenly. Some say illness, others whisper poison. Harald didn't waste time mourning. He seized the throne of Norway without blinking and made it crystal clear. He was now sole king, but he wasn't satisfied. He wanted Denmark too. And so began nearly 2 decades of war between Harald and Svein Estridsson. Raids, battles, skirmishes. Harald hammered Danish coasts with the same energy he once brought to Arab fortresses. He burned towns, seized ships, and left no village unplundered. Yet he could never quite hold the land. Denmark resisted, Svein survived, and the throne remained out of reach. Still, Norway was his, and Harald ruled it like a man who had spent 20 years fighting for the right to wear a crown. But he hadn't forgotten about England, and soon his eyes turned west. By the late 1040s, Harald Hardrada sat on the throne of Norway, not just as a warlord turned king, but as the last true Viking monarch. He ruled with the discipline of Byzantium, the ferocity of Rus, and the ambition of a man who had never forgotten what it meant to lose. His rule was anything but gentle. Harald raised taxes, centralized power, and crushed dissent. Nobles who opposed him either bent the knee or vanished. He used his wealth to maintain a standing army and a fleet, an unheard-of luxury for Norwegian kings of the time. He built churches, minted coins, and made it clear Norway wasn't some northern backwater anymore. It was a real kingdom with real teeth. But Harald's idea of kingship was medieval realpolitik. He wanted loyalty, but only after obedience. He wanted peace, but on his terms. If a local chieftain challenged him, Harald sent troops. If peasants protested taxes, they met swords. He wasn't a tyrant, he was just Viking royalty with imperial instincts. And the Norwegians, frankly, didn't know what hit them. Still, his reign wasn't all steel and fire. Harald was also a man of culture. He wrote poetry, often about himself naturally, and supported skalds who immortalized his deeds in verse. He maintained trade routes across Europe, and even re-established contacts with the Byzantine court, just in case his treasure stash needed revisiting. He also never stopped warring with Denmark. Every summer, like clockwork, he'd launch a new raid, sailing down to Danish shores, torching villages, taunting Svein Estridsson like an annual reminder that he still had a score to settle. These campaigns were less about conquest now, and more about pride. Harald couldn't let go, and Svein refused to die. But even Harald knew he was getting older. By the early 1060s, he started grooming his son Olaf Kira for the throne. He probably expected to rule a few more decades, retire into legend, maybe die in his sleep surrounded by gold and loyal warriors. But then came 1066, the year England exploded into chaos. Edward the Confessor had died without an heir, competing claims flooded in, and Harald, grey at the temples but still sharp as a spear, saw his last great chance. He didn't just want Norway or Denmark anymore, he was coming for England. 1066 wasn't just a year. It was the year, the kind that turns a king into a legend or a corpse.
And Harald Hardrada, nearing 50 but still built like a bear, was about to roll the dice one last time. Edward the Confessor, King of England, had died childless. The throne was up for grabs. Harold Godwinson claimed it. William of Normandy prepared to invade. But then, from the icy north, came Harold. Because why not? He had half-baked claim through an old deal with the Danish King Cunut, who once ruled England. Did it make sense legally? No, not really. But in Viking logic, a claim plus an army equals a throne, and Harold brought an army. He allied with Tostig Godwinson, the bitter exiled brother of Harold, England's new king. Tostig promised English support. Harold promised steel. With around 300 longships and over 10,000 warriors, he sailed across the North Sea, just like Viking ancestors had done for centuries. Only this time, it wasn't a raid. It was a full-scale invasion. In September 1066, he landed near the Humber and advanced toward York. The English weren't ready.
At the Battle of Fulford, Harold crushed a hastily assembled force under the northern earls. The gates of northern England opened, York surrendered, the old Viking magic was back. Harold was confident. This wasn't Byzantium's twisted politics or Denmark's stalemates. This was raw conquest. He set up camp at Stamford Bridge, demanding hostages from the region. And then, surprise, Harold Godwinson, the English king, had force-marched his army north from London in under a week. He arrived at Stamford Bridge on September 25th, catching Harold's forces completely off guard. Many of Harold's men had left their armour behind, expecting negotiations, not a battle. What followed was brutal. The Vikings fought fiercely. But they were outmaneuvered, outnumbered, unprepared. One berserker reportedly held the bridge alone, buying time. But even Viking courage had its limits. In the melee, Harold took an arrow to the throat. The Viking thunderhead fell in battle, swinging his sword until the very end. It was the last great Viking invasion of England, and with Harold's death, the Viking Age itself died with him. September 25th, 1066. Harold Hardrada met his fate on a grassy field near Stamford Bridge, and with him died the last true Viking dream of conquest. It was supposed to be a negotiation day. Harold had left his chainmail behind, basking in the afterglow of victory at Fulford. His men were relaxing, the weather was mild, England looked ripe for the taking. Then came the dust cloud. Harold Godwinson had pulled off one of the fastest troop movements in medieval history. He and his army had marched nearly 200 miles in under 4 days, and they didn't arrive quietly. The English caught the Norwegians totally unprepared, scattered, and mostly unarmoured. What followed was not a battle, it was a slaughter. Still, the Vikings didn't roll over. They fought with the desperation of men who knew the North Sea was too far behind them. A single warrior blocked the narrow bridge with a massive axe, delaying the English advance and turning himself into instant legend. He allegedly killed over 40 men before being stabbed from beneath the bridge by a spear. That's how desperate things were. Kings were relying on bridge trolls to buy them time. Harold, once he realized what was happening, scrambled to form a shield wall, but it was chaos. Men arriving in pairs, without armor, rushing into formation as arrows rained down. Then the English cavalry slammed into their flanks. The shield wall held for a while. Harold himself fought like the berserker he was once trained to be. According to legend, he swung a massive two-handed sword with both hands, towering above his men like a war god. He killed, bled, and roared. Then came the arrow, straight through the windpipe. The last great Viking king fell without a final word. When reinforcements from the ships finally arrived under Eystein Ore, Harold's standard-bearer, it was too late. They found the field littered with corpses. Eystein himself died in what became known as Ore's storm, a doomed counterattack that ended in more Norse blood-soaking English soil. Out of Harold's massive fleet of 300 ships, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors back to Norway. The message was clear. The age of Viking conquest was over. The dragon ships would sail home, but their fire was gone. Harold Hardrada's death at Stamford Bridge didn't just end a campaign, it closed a chapter in world history, the Viking Age, that glorious, brutal, gold-hungry century of raids, sagas, and longships had officially breathed its last, and fittingly, it died with a Viking king falling in battle far from home, sword in hand, lungs filling with blood. But the impact rippled far beyond the battlefield. In the days after the battle, Harold Godwinson barely had time to breathe. As the Norwegians limped back to their ships, Harold received word that another invasion had landed in the south. William of Normandy. Had Harold not attacked when he did, Harold Godwinson might have had more time to prepare. Instead, barely 3 weeks after crushing one invader, he had to face another. At Hastings, on October the 14th, Harold fell to the Normans, and England passed into new hands. So, in a strange twist of fate, Harold Hardrada, who failed to take the English crown, may have paved the way for William to do just that. The chaos Harold brought north weakened the kingdom just enough to crack open the door. Meanwhile, back in Norway, the news hit like a cold wave. The once invincible Harold, hero of Rus, scourge of Byzantium, ruler of a proud kingdom, was gone. His son, Olaf Kyrre, took the throne, but Olaf wasn't his father. He was a quieter ruler, more interested in peace than plunder. Under his reign, Norway stabilized. The old Viking fire cooled into politics, trade, and Christianity. The longships were still there, but they stopped being weapons and became tools of commerce. No more berserkers charging monasteries, no more gods demanding blood on the beaches, no more kings with their eyes fixed west, dreaming of silver and conquest. The sagas would still be sung, but the men who inspired them were now ghosts. Harold's life was the Viking world's last great epic, from snowy Norway to the golden domes of Constantinople, from steppe skirmishes to English meadows. He embodied everything the Viking age stood for: bravery, ambition, ruthlessness, and above all, motion. But after Stamford Bridge, that motion stopped, and the Norse world turned its gaze inward. The Viking age had ended, the medieval world had begun. Harold Hardrada's death may have marked the end of the Viking age, but his legacy was too large to be buried with him. Even centuries later, his story echoes through sagas, ballads, and history books like a battle horn across a fjord. He wasn't just a king, he was a symbol of a dying age and of Viking ambition at its wildest, and of what happens when a man refuses to fade quietly into history. Historians argue over how to define Harold. Was he a conqueror, a poet, a cold-blooded killer? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the middle. He wrote verse, but also ordered raids that reduced villages to ash. He built churches in Norway, but also left fields soaked with blood from Sicily to Stamford Bridge. He was both brute and bard, builder and destroyer. But what no one questions is his greatness. No other Viking travelled as far, fought in as many wars, or accumulated as much wealth and renown as Harold. He served emperors, defied kings, and bent whole armies to his will, while most Norse leaders faded into legend with a few sagas and a cairn. Harold carved his name into 3 empires. His poetry survives. His name echoes in the Heimskringla and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and his exploits still challenge modern filmmakers, writers, and scholars to figure out how one man could pack 3 lifetimes into 50 years. Even the name Hardrada, meaning hard ruler, speaks volumes. It wasn't an insult, it was a warning. Harold didn't bend. He ruled as he fought, with fire in his blood and a blade in his hand. After his death, Norway changed. Olaf Kyrre, his son, ushered in peace and prosperity. Trade blossomed, the sword was sheathed, and the Viking era turned into memory. But Harold remained larger than life. In Norway, he became a national icon. In Iceland, a saga subject. In England, a cautionary tale. And in Byzantium, a ghost of the north who once stood guard over emperors. He was the last Viking king, and he died as he lived, with a sword in his hand chasing a crown. When the long ships stopped sailing and the mead halls quieted, the world turned. But Harold Hardrada had already made sure it would remember his name. To the Vikings, a ship wasn't just wood, nails, and sailcloth. It was identity, legacy, and destiny. It was how you traded, how you raided, how you traveled, and how you passed on. So when a chieftain or warrior died, burying them in a ship wasn't just ceremonial. It was essential. In Viking belief, the ship was a sacred vessel that bridged the world of the living and the dead. Just as a warrior sailed across the sea in life to conquer foreign lands, they would now sail across the metaphysical sea to reach the afterlife. This wasn't a quaint superstition, it was a cosmic law. Life was a voyage, and death was simply the next leg of the journey. That's why these ship burials were so elaborate. The ship itself had to be worthy. We're talking about long ships, up to 70 feet long, carved with dragon-headed prows and built to cut through waves, and apparently through spiritual dimensions. The body would be laid in the center, typically on a bed or pile of furs. Around it, the mourners would begin to fill the ship, not with tears, but with gear. Weapons, of course, a sword, axe, shield, and spear, because even the dead needed to be ready for battle in the afterlife. But also tools, clothing, jewelry, and occasionally more morbid cargo, slaves, horses, and even hawks, sacrificed to serve the master in death as they had in life. To us, this sounds brutal. To the Vikings, well, it was honor. The ship was then buried under tons of earth, creating a mound, a permanent marker of power. These weren't just tombs, they were statements. Here lies someone important enough to deserve a ship to the next world, and it wasn't just men. Some of the most magnificent ship burials, like the famous Oseberg burial, belonged to women. Viking queens, priestesses, and aristocrats were also sent into the soil with ships and riches, proving that spiritual passage wasn't just for the sword-swinging elite. So when we say Vikings lived and died by the sea, we mean it literally. For them, the ship wasn't just how you conquered foreign lands, it was how you conquered death. If Viking ship burials sound like legend, the Oseberg and Gokstad discoveries turned legend into fact. These weren't dusty old grave pits, they were time capsules, fully intact ships pulled from beneath the Norwegian soil, packed with splendor, secrets, and the unmistakable smell of legacy. Let's start with the Oseberg ship, unearthed in 1904. When farmers started digging near a burial mound in southeastern Norway, they didn't expect to hit a 70-foot-long dragon ship. But there it was, immaculately preserved, under the clay, almost untouched by time. The prow rose in a graceful serpentine curve, its surface covered in intricate carvings. The craftsmanship was staggering. This wasn't a warship, it was ceremonial, a royal hearse for someone exceptional. But here's the twist. The Oseberg burial held two women, one older, likely noble or royal, the other younger, possibly a servant or a high priestess. The older woman may have been a queen or a powerful vulva, a Viking seeress. Her body was draped in silk and wool, surrounded by carved sledges, chests, buckets, animal remains, and even a cart with wheels as cathedral windows. Two sacrificed oxen lay at the prow. This wasn't a quiet funeral, it was a cosmic launch party. Then there's the Gokstad ship, discovered in 1880 and far more battle-ready, sleek, fast, and armed for war. Inside was the skeleton of a man in his 40s, likely a chieftain or warrior king. His identity remains a mystery, but he was buried with grandeur. Shields lined the sides of the ship, and beside him were beds, weapons, gaming pieces, and the remains of 12 horses, 6 dogs, and even 2 peacocks. Yes, peacocks. These ship graves reveal more than wealth. They reveal beliefs. The Oseberg burial spoke of ritual and female power. The Gokstad ship hinted at prestige, conquest, and global trade. Together, they show how the Vikings tied death to travel, how the next world wasn't a place you waited for, but a destination you sailed to. These were no ordinary graves. These were declarations, echoes of power, floating temples buried in the earth, and they were just the beginning. A Viking funeral wasn't just a somber goodbye, it was a spectacle, a powerful, theatrical rite of passage. designed to launch the dead into the next world and make sure the living never forgot their name. And ship burials, they were the main event. It all began with the body. The deceased wasn't just placed on a pile of wood like an afterthought. Their body was washed, dressed in fine garments, silk if available, embroidered wool if not, and often adorned with jewelry or symbols of status. In some cases, they were even posed as if peacefully asleep, cradling weapons or seated upright in a ceremonial posture. Then came the rituals, and this is where things got a little blood-stained. Accounts like the one by Arab traveller Ibn Fadlan give chilling insight into Viking funeral rites, especially among the Rus, a Norse group in Eastern Europe. In one account, when a chieftain died, a slave girl volunteered, or was selected, to join him in death over days. She was treated like royalty, washed, dressed, paraded. Then at the funeral, she was sacrificed, strangled and stabbed in a grisly ceremony involving chants, drums, and alcohol-fueled ecstasy. Animals weren't spared either. Horses were slaughtered to carry the soul. Dogs, hawks, and even cows were offered as companions or guardians. In rare cases, boats were surrounded by ringed stone circles, believed to symbolize the boundary between worlds. As for the ship, it wasn't always buried intact. Sometimes it was burned, set ablaze, and pushed out to sea in a flaming farewell that lit the night sky. Other times, it was placed in a dugout pit and covered in stones or earth to form a burial mound. The choice depended on status, location, and sometimes sheer practicality. Burning a longship wasn't cheap. These funerals weren't just religious, they were political. A massive burial was a public show of power. This was no ordinary man. The message went, this was someone whose death shook the earth and whose journey to the gods deserves thunder. The ship burials were violent, beautiful, and deeply spiritual. They weren't sending the dead away, they were launching them like stars into eternity. Thanks to Hollywood, most people picture a Viking funeral the same way. A blazing longship drifting out to sea, flames licking the sky, while stoic warriors watch from the shore. It's cinematic, it's dramatic, it's also mostly fiction. So what's the truth? The reality is that ship burials, not burnings, were far more common in the archaeological record. Burial mounds like Oseberg, Gokstad, and Thun show longships carefully placed in the ground, loaded with grave goods and covered with soil or stones. These weren't one-size-fits-all either. Some ship graves were massive and extravagant, others were simple and modest, but the key was preservation. The ship wasn't destroyed, it was transformed into a tomb. So where does the burning come from? That fiery farewell comes mainly from literary sources, like the Icelandic sagas and foreign eyewitness accounts. For example, Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan describes a Rus's funeral where a chieftain's ship was set on fire with the body and sacrificial victims inside. But even that example is complicated. It might not have been a full ship, but rather a symbolic structure shaped like one. It's possible that ship burnings did happen, especially in regions where burial wasn't feasible or where fire held symbolic weight. A cremation at sea would make sense if burial land was limited, or if the person was meant to join the gods in dramatic fashion. But from an archaeological standpoint, burned ship remains are extremely rare. In truth, the idea of a burning ship may have been as important as the act itself. Fire was sacred to the Norse. It purified, it transformed. A flaming ship wasn't just spectacle, it was a spiritual engine, sending the soul through smoke to the gods above. But burial had advantages. It preserved legacy and it left a physical monument, something the living could return to. A mound was a marker, a memory in earth, and that mattered in a society where honor, lineage, and saga were everything. So which was real? Both. But buried ships left the bones of history behind. The flaming ones, they left only legend and smoke. Forget the stereotype of Viking women waiting at home, weaving by the hearth, in death, just like in life. Norse women could command awe, fear, and ceremony. And nowhere is that clearer than in the ship burials of Viking Age women, especially those that rivaled and sometimes outshone their male counterparts. The Oseberg burial remains the most striking example. Unearthed in 1904, it housed not one, but two women, one older, one younger, laid to rest in one of the most lavish Viking ships ever found. The ship itself was a masterpiece. Sweeping curves, carved dragon heads and planks, fit for a king. But this wasn't a warrior's grave. It was a queen's, or possibly a vulva. A vulva was a seeress, a sorceress, a prophetess who walked the line between worlds. And the grave goods in Oseberg, wands, staffs and mystical animal remains, hint at ritual and magic. If the main figure was indeed a vulva, then the burial honored not just political power, but spiritual authority. In Norse society, that could be just as influential as swordsmanship. And then there's the sheer wealth: sledges, carts, textiles, tapestries, imported silks, ceremonial beds and sacrificed animals, all packed around these women as if they were being sent not just to the afterlife, but to continue ruling it. Other graves across Scandinavia confirm this pattern. The Gausel Queen, buried near Stavanger, was laid to rest with gold jewellery, imported bronze vessels and fine riding gear. Her grave radiated status. The Ladby ship also showed signs of high-status female interment, and scholars still debate whether some warrior graves, complete with weapons, belonged to women, DNA evidence from a grave in Berka. Sweden suggests that one high-ranking warrior buried with a full arsenal was biologically female. So what does this tell us? That in Viking culture, women could hold power and take it with them, whether as aristocrats, queens, priestesses, or shield maidens. They weren't excluded from the ship burials, they were centered in them. They didn't just accompany kings in death, sometimes they were the kings. When a Viking was buried in a ship, they didn't go alone, and they were sent off with grave goods, a curated collection of the objects they might need, want, or deserve in the afterlife. But this wasn't just about swords and silver. These ships were packed like time capsules, giving us a strange and fascinating window into Viking life and Viking death. First, the weapons. Almost every elite ship burial includes them. Swords with decorated hilts, spears, shields, and battle axes. But these weren't just backups for ghost fighting in Valhalla. They were a statement. A sword showed that the dead had power, status, and honor. In some cases, the blades were deliberately bent or broken, not out of disrespect, but to kill the weapon and let it follow its master to the afterlife. But weapons weren't the only tools packed for the voyage. There were everyday items too. Combs, cooking pots, whetstones, even board games. These burials didn't assume the afterlife was an endless battlefield. The dead might still need to groom themselves, prepare meals, or pass the time with a quick game of Neferteffel while waiting for Ragnarok. It was a full-service departure. Then there were the animals. Lots of animals. In the Gokstad burial alone, archaeologists found the remains of 12 horses, 8 dogs and 2 peacocks. Yeah, peacocks. Horses were meant to carry the soul. Dogs were loyal companions, and peacocks, possibly a status symbol, or maybe just an extravagant touch by someone who didn't want to be upstaged in death. The most unsettling grave goods were people. Slaves, servants or companions, were sometimes sacrificed and placed in the ship to accompany the dead. Whether they went willingly or not is up for debate, but their presence speaks volumes about Viking beliefs in duty beyond death. Everything in a ship burial was chosen deliberately. It told a story. This person was a warrior. This person loved fine clothing. This one had wealth. That one had power. Grave goods weren't junk. They were a final biography written in gold, iron, and bone. And once packed, sealed, and buried, the ship became a floating home beneath the earth. While the image of a Viking ship burial often conjures up the fjords of Norway, these elaborate funerary practices weren't confined to a single region. From icy Scandinavia to the river valleys of Eastern Europe, Viking ship burials took on unique forms, each tailored to local traditions, terrain, and power structures. Let's begin with Norway, the homeland of the most famous ship burials like Oseberg and Gokstad. These were grand, mound-covered ships buried with kings, queens, and nobles, Norway's rugged landscape offered excellent preservation conditions, allowing wooden ships and grave goods to survive for centuries. The focus here was on monumentality, large burial mounds and ships carved with mythic imagery. It was less about hiding the dead and more about displaying their status to the living. In Sweden, ship burials took on a slightly different flavour. At sites like Vendel and Valsgarda, ships weren't always buried whole. Sometimes just the shape of the ship was outlined with stones, like a skeletal frame on the landscape. These stone ship settings were often used in cremation burials, with the ashes placed in urns or scattered within the stone enclosure. The Swedes embraced a hybrid of fire and stone, powerful symbolism without the need for massive earthworks. Then there's the Rus, the Norse-descended warriors and traders who settled along the river routes of modern-day Russia, Ukraine and Belarus. The most detailed account of their funerary customs comes from Ibn Fadlan, who witnessed a dramatic ship-burning ceremony along the Volga River. While archaeological evidence of full ship burials in the east is rarer, boat-shaped cremation mounds and grave goods echo the same core values: a journey, a transition, and a spectacle. In Denmark, evidence for ship burials is more fragmentary. The marshy soils aren't kind to wood preservation, and fewer ship graves have survived, but stone ship settings and elite graves with seafaring symbolism suggest that the practice, though perhaps less monumental, was still present. Even in Scotland, Ireland, and parts of the Baltic, boat-shaped graves appear, sometimes as literal ships, other times just as stone outlines. Wherever Vikings travelled, they brought their belief in the ship as the ultimate vehicle. Across water, across time, across death. The ship burial was adaptable, it evolved, but the message remained the same. You don't walk into the afterlife, you sail there. For the Vikings, death was not the end, it was a departure. And that's what makes ship burials so powerful. They weren't just about honouring the dead with a flashy funeral. They were built on a deep mythic belief that the afterlife was a voyage and the soul needed a vessel. In Norse cosmology, the world was shaped by water, from the great ocean encircling Midgard to the rivers that separated realms. Everything flowed. Life came from the sea, and so naturally did death. It's no coincidence that ships appear in Viking mythology not only as tools of war and trade, but as spiritual bridges. Consider Naglfar, the ship made of the fingernails of the dead, which sails during Ragnarok to unleash chaos upon the gods.
Or Skidbladnir, the magical ship of the god Freya, which could fold up and fit in a pocket, yet always had a favourable wind. These mythic ships weren't just stories, they shaped real funerary practices. Every buried longship echoed the legends, turning myth into ritual. To be buried in a ship meant you were going somewhere. Valhalla, perhaps, a glorious hall for warriors who died bravely. Or Folkvanga, the field ruled by the goddess Freya, where half of the slain went. Or for those who didn't earn honour, the gloomy realm of hell, ruled by a half-rotting goddess of the same name. Wherever your soul went, it didn't walk, it sailed. And the sea journey didn't just apply to elite warriors. Even humble cremation burials often included boat shapes formed by stones or wood, marking the dead's passage across unseen waters. The ship was a metaphor made real, carving through both waves and worlds. Viking funeral ships were cosmic tools.
By placing the dead in a vessel surrounded by weapons, animals, and treasure, they weren't just provisioning a tomb, they were arming a traveller, someone about to cross the divide between Midgard and the great beyond. And to the living. The ship wasn't a final goodbye, it was a launch, a reminder that the journey didn't end in the grave, it only changed course. 1,000 years have passed since the Viking ship burials slid into the earth, but their stories are still unfolding. These vessels of death, once buried in silence, now speak louder than ever through museums, excavations, and the imagination of millions. Today, the Oseberg, Gokstad and tin ships rest in glass-walled halls in Norway, preserved not as morbid relics, but as cultural treasures. Tourists stare up at the curved prows, marveling at the craftsmanship, the symbolism, the audacity of people who turned a boat into a coffin and a grave into a gateway. These ships were never meant to sail again, and yet they have. Not across oceans, but through time. And it's not just archaeologists who are listening. Writers, filmmakers, and game designers continue to be inspired by Viking funerals, from epic scenes in movies like The 13th Warrior or How to Train Your Dragon to blazing send-offs in TV shows like Vikings. The ship burial has become one of the most iconic images of Norse culture. Is it historically accurate every time? Not really, but the spirit remains. Death as a voyage, the ship as a symbol. Even modern Scandinavians feel the echo. Some Viking descendants have requested ashes to be scattered at sea, or ceremonies modelled after ship burials. No slaves, thankfully, but still honouring that deep connection between the vessel and the soul. A few brave experimental archaeologists have even rebuilt burial ships, launching replicas on rivers and seas to understand the engineering and magic of the originals. What's truly remarkable is how much we've learned from the ships themselves. Their wood tells us about forests now gone. Their construction reveals knowledge of engineering rivaling that of the Mediterranean. And their grave goods, peacocks, silk, silver coins map a Viking world far wider than just Scandinavia. The Viking ship burial wasn't just a funeral, it was a final performance. One last act in a life of war, trade, poetry, and power. And even now, these ships are still performing, reminding us that the dead were once alive, that myth and memory are hard to separate, and that some vessels never stop moving, they just sail through different seas. Courtly love wasn't about marriage and procreation or building a stable home. It was about longing, impossibility, and a strange blend of suffering and ecstasy. And by the 12th century, this concept had become so popular among the nobility that it actually developed its own unwritten rulebook, part seduction manual, part philosophical exercise, and entirely out of sync with reality. Born in the courts of southern France, especially in the region of Aquitaine, courtly love was less about real emotion and more about performance. Noblemen, and often knights, would devote themselves to a lady, usually of higher status or already married. But instead of aiming to win her over in a romantic sense, the knight's goal was to worship her from afar. He would compose poems, undertake dangerous quests in her name, and suffer gloriously in silence. If this sounds like emotional masochism dressed up in armor, it kind of was. The rules were clear. Love must be secret, it must be difficult, and it must never be fully consummated, because once fulfilled, the love lost its purity. In this game, suffering was the point. A knight's heartbreak was proof of his devotion. The more hopeless the love, the nobler the spirit. This new code of love intertwined with the ideals of chivalry, the knightly code of honor, service, and bravery. A perfect knight was brave in battle and humble before his lady. Love wasn't a distraction from knighthood, it was a test of it. A knight who could endure heartbreak without breaking his vows, or honor, was the true ideal. And yet, courtly love was deeply hypocritical. While the knight composed flowery verses about his lady's golden hair and impossible grace, her marriage to a powerful nobleman continued undisturbed. And while the ideals emphasize restraint and virtue, history is littered with affairs, scandals, and even duels sparked by these supposedly platonic obsessions. Still, the idea caught fire. Poets, troubadours, and minstrels made careers crafting tales of knights who bled for love, ladies who wept for honor, and the eternal ache of desire unfulfilled. Real or not, the fantasy of courtly love reshaped how medieval Europe thought about passion, power, and gender. Love had become more than an emotion, it had become a code. Before Shakespeare or sonnets, there were troubadours, wandering poet-musicians who turned unrequited love into an art form. One lute note and heartbreak stanza at a time. These were not peasants singing about ale and harvests. They were often nobles themselves, well-educated, multilingual, and well aware of how dangerous and addictive it was to sing about another man's wife. The troubadour movement began in Occitania, in what is now southern France. During the late 11th and early 12th centuries, these performers composed songs in Occitan, a Romance language, and their subject was nearly always the same. Unattainable love, a knight hopelessly enamoured with a noble lady, a lady trapped in marriage but worshipped from afar. It was all beautifully orchestrated misery. Troubadour songs weren't performed in smoky taverns but in the great halls of castles. The audience, lords and ladies who saw their own secret desires mirrored in the verses. A good troubadour could make a duchess blush with a single metaphor. A great one could start a scandal that lasted for generations. These poets developed a refined vocabulary of longing, fine aimer, or refined love. It wasn't about lust, but about admiration, humility, and internal agony. Love, in their view, was supposed to hurt. The lady was always placed on a pedestal, near divine and untouchable. The man, often a knight or poet, would express his worth through service, suffering, and soul-bearing lyricism. Some of the most famous troubadours were actual historical figures. Geoffrey Rudel, who claimed to have fallen in love with a woman he'd never met, Bernard de Ventadorn, who turned heartbreak into hit songs, and Eleanor of Aquitaine, a patron of the arts who likely inspired many of these tales, and perhaps lived them too. Troubadours didn't just invent medieval love songs, they invented the idea that expressing love through art was noble, even holy. Their influence spread across Europe, giving rise to similar traditions in Italy with the Dolce Stil Novo, Germany with the Mini Singers, and eventually England. What they started was bigger than music. It was a cultural obsession that would define how love was written, sung, and mythologized for centuries. They didn't just perform for the court, they taught the court how to love. In the world of courtly love, the woman was everything: muse, judge, goddess, untouchable prize. She sat on a metaphorical and sometimes literal pedestal, worshipped by knights and praised in verse. But this glorification wasn't exactly empowering. It was flattering, yeah, but also confining, idealized, and often impossible to live up to. The lady of courtly romance was typically noble, married, and out of reach, and that was the point. The more unattainable she was, the more pure the love seemed. Her beauty was described in impossibly poetic terms. Skin like ivory, eyes like stars, hair like woven gold. But these women weren't described as real individuals. They were more like living symbols, meant to inspire devotion and suffering in equal measure. For men, this idealization offered a noble excuse for emotional vulnerability. A knight could weep, sigh, or write poetry without being seen as weak, because his love for this lady was considered sacred. For women, however, it was a trap. They were expected to inspire love without ever acting on it. They had to maintain their grace, dignity, and virtue at all times, while being watched, desired, and sometimes stalked by persistent suitors armed with ballads. Occasionally, the lady held real power in these dynamics. In some tales, she was the one setting challenges, commanding loyalty, or even testing her knight's devotion. But this power was almost always symbolic. In reality, most noble women had limited freedom, often married off for alliances and status before they were 15. And yet, courtly love gave them something rare in the Middle Ages: visibility. In a world dominated by men's voices, courtly love placed women at the center of the narrative. They became the subject of songs, the reason for quests, and the heart of medieval romantic imagination. Some women played the game well. Historical figures like Eleanor of Aquitaine and her daughter Marie de Champagne weren't just muses, they were patrons of this culture, encouraging poets and commissioning love literature that reflected their ideals, and sometimes their politics. But even at its best, courtly love wasn't about partnership. It was about distance, elevation, and longing. The lady was adored, but rarely known. She was a fantasy with a crown. And fantasies don't get to speak. Chivalry began as a practical battlefield code: loyalty to lord, courage under fire, mercy to the fallen. But once courtly love seeped into the armor, chivalry grew a silk-lined interior. Every lance charge, every oath, every polished spur could now double as a love letter. A knight no longer fought only for king and kingdom. He fought for the smile, or even the rumour of a smile of a distant lady. A perfect courtly knight followed a three-tiered hierarchy of loyalties. First God, morning prayers before dawn patrols. Second, his feudal lord, unquestioned service in war and peace. Third, his lady, the invisible beacon guiding every gesture. Where earlier warriors hoisted battle standards, the courtly knight tied a lady's token, perhaps a ribbon, a veil, or a sleeve, around his arm. It wasn't camouflage. It was a public declaration that his sword's edge carried a private agenda. Tournaments, originally blunt weapon training grounds, transformed into love theatre. Lists surrounding the tilting field were draped with banners, and each knight announced whose favour he bore. A victorious tilt wasn't merely a martial triumph, it proved a lover's worthiness. Chroniclers record knights collapsing from exhaustion rather than withdrawing and risking the shame of appearing less devoted than their rivals. That devotion demanded self-discipline bordering on asceticism. Manuals like Andreas Capellanus's De Amore preached that a true lover remained humble, courteous, and discreet. He must guard her reputation more fiercely than his own life, endure jealous rivals without complaint, and, cruelest rule of all, rejoice in service even if love were never returned. The pain itself was proof of sincerity, yet beneath the velvet rhetoric lurked steel-clad reality. Castles needed garrisons, roads teemed with bandits, and foreign crusades beckoned. Knights wrote poetry at night but sharpened blades at dawn. The same hand that tenderly penned a rondo could sever a helm in battle hours later. Medieval commentators noticed the contradiction, but that paradox was the point. The greater the contrast between brutality and tenderness, the nobler the knight. Of course, real hearts complicated the code. Secret trysts happened, scandals erupted, reputations shattered, but the ideal remained tantalizing, a harmony where courage met courtesy, where a warrior's strength bowed to a lady's grace. For a medieval audience, drowning in wars and arranged marriages, that ideal was intoxicating. Thus, chivalry, armoured in iron, yet perfumed with longing, became the operating system of aristocratic romance. Fight hard, love harder, preferably from a respectful, poetic distance. Every code invites a breach, and courtly love, so obsessed with secrecy and yearning, practically begged for real-world transgression. Beneath the airy verses and tournament pageantry simmered flesh and blood temptation. When fantasy stepped off the parchment, it ignited some of the Middle Ages' juiciest scandals. Take Peter Abelard and Heloise. Abelard was Europe's rock star philosopher, Heloise his brilliant teenage student. Their relationship began like a textbook courtly romance, secret lessons turning into poetry, and stolen glances until it became very real, very physical, and very public. The fallout was brutal. A furious uncle, a clandestine child, a forced marriage, Abelard's infamous castration, and both lovers ending their days in separate monasteries, composing letters that dripped equal parts theology and heartbreak. Courtly ideals promised ennobling devotion, reality delivered mutilation and lifelong penance. High politics weren't immune either. Eleanor of Aquitaine, doyenne of troubadour culture, was whispered to entertain flirtations aplenty, most notoriously with her uncle Raymond of Poitiers during the Second Crusade. Whether true or not, the rumours helped poison her marriage to Louis VII and reshape the map of Europe when she married Henry Plantagenet. Love songs could topple thrones, even royal daughters weren't safe. The Tour de Nesle affair of 1314 saw 3 French princesses, thanks to a servant's gossip, accused of adulterous rendezvous in a Parisian tower. 2 marriages were annulled, alleged lovers were flayed and hanged. The disgraced women spent years in convent prisons. Chivalric rhetoric praised female virtue. The justice system had iron chains waiting when virtue cracked. Then there were the quieter tragedies. Nameless ladies banished to remote castles for exchanging letters. Knights forced onto crusade as penance for suspicion of dalliance. abbots preaching sermons that compared a wandering heart to a rusted sword. The church never outlawed courtly love outright, but ecclesiastical courts issued plenty of fines for inordinate familiarity, proof that passion, however poetically packaged, still breached canonical law. What these episodes reveal is the tension at the core of chivalric romance, a celebration of illicit desire coupled with a rigid social order determined to punish it. The same society that applauded a knight's size expected him to stop short of consummation. When vows slipped, reputations burned, sometimes literally. Thus the dream of refined devotion collided with the hard stone of medieval power. Courtly love could inspire poetry. Yes, it could also wreck lives, and every scandal only sharpened the allure of the next whispered liaison. Because nothing fuels a romance like the promise of ruin. If troubadours composed the soundtrack of courtly love, medieval authors provided the big-budget cinematic universe. Beginning in the late 12th century, writers like Chrétien d'Artois took the raw material of longing, secrecy, and knightly angst and forged the first blockbuster romances, prose and verse narratives where love was not a subplot but the engine of destiny. Enter King Arthur's court, a fictional laboratory for every chivalric dilemma. In Lancelot, the Knight of the Cart, Chrétien unveiled the ultimate courtly triangle, the flawless Queen Guinevere, her duty-bound husband Arthur, and the peerless but fatally smitten Sir Lancelot. Lancelot performs impossible feats, crosses a sword-blade bridge, defeats entire armies, yet his greatest trial is emotional, loving a woman he can never openly claim. Chrétien packed the tale with all the rules of fine amour, secret meetings, symbolic tokens, and the ever-present threat of ruin. Readers went wild. Knights suddenly wanted to be Lancelot, except for the lifelong adultery headache. Arthurian romance spread like wildfire across Europe. In Germany, Wolfram von Eschenbach gave us Parzival, where the hero's spiritual maturation is inseparable from his respect for chaste love. In England, later, poets stitched together sprawling cycles, the Vulgate cycle, the post-Vulgate, and ultimately Sir Thomas Malory's 15th century Le Mot d'Arthur, which sealed Arthurian tragedy into Western canon. Love as glory, love as downfall. Not all literary romance wore plate armor. Around 1230, Guillaume de Law began The Romance of the Rose, an allegorical dreamscape where the beloved rose is locked inside a walled garden and every courtly virtue, humility, courtesy, pity, takes human form. 4 decades later, Jean de Meunès continued it, adding biting satire that mocked clerics, nobles, and the very love code readers adored. The poem became the Middle Ages' most owned bestseller, copied in hundreds of manuscripts and debated in university halls. Was it moral handbook or bawdy parody? Yes, these texts did more than entertain. They standardized the language of yearning. Metaphors? Love as service, the beloved as shining light. Jealousy as a dungeon became clichés, precisely because bards and lovers alike borrowed them wholesale. Even real courts used romances as etiquette manuals: how to bow, speak, flatter, despair correctly. Literary romance thus performed a sly double act. It celebrated the ideals troubadours praised, bravery for love's sake, while simultaneously exposing their contradictions. Fiction made courtly love feel grander than life and truer than truth, ensuring that generations who never met a troubadour still learned how to ache with impeccable style. Courtly love's perfume didn't reach heaven unnoticed. As troubadour refrains floated over castle walls, bishops smelled sulphur. How could a culture that exalted adultery, emotional idolatry, and carefully managed lust coexist with Christian teaching on fidelity and humility? Spoiler, it couldn't, at least not without a holy tug-of-war. Preachers struck first. By the early 13th century, sermon collections like Jacques de Vitry's Exemplar warned congregations of knights who rode to tournaments for a lady's ribbon and returned with a ticket to damnation. The Dominican Stephen of Bourbon labelled troubadours peddlers of vanity, whose songs corroded both chastity and social order. Moralists coined the term amour déraillé, disordered love, to separate proper marital affection from the poetic fever sweeping court halls. Ecclesiastical courts followed with fines and penances. A knight discovered exchanging love tokens during Lent might be sentenced to a barefoot pilgrimage or forced to fund church candles, a literal fee for flaunting figurative fire. Confessors' manuals advised priests to grill penitents about clandestine liaisons. Suspicious poetry exchanges, even excessive daydreaming, desire itself became a taxable offence, payable in prayers. Yet repression was complicated by patronage. Many great patrons of love poetry, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Marie de Champagne, Blanche of Castile, were also enthusiastic benefactors of monasteries and cathedrals. Bishops condemning courtly verse on Sunday might dine with a poetry-loving queen on Tuesday. Excommunication, therefore, remained mostly rhetorical. Social capitulation proved more pragmatic. Some clerics tried jiu-jitsu instead of censure. Andreas Capellanus's De Amore, commissioned, legend says, by Marie de Champagne, presents 31 rules of love, only to conclude with a chapter advising readers to renounce the whole system as sinful folly. The treatise functions like a carnival mirror, reflecting courtly ideals so precisely that they reveal their own absurdity. Moral commentary disguised as manual, satirists piled on. The Roman de la Rose, especially Jean de Munez's continuation, portrays courtly seduction techniques as both entertaining and morally bankrupt. Jealous husbands appear, nurses peddle tricks, and the heroine's virtue is finally breached. The poem became university study material, proof that laughter could wound deeper than anathema. Despite all this pushback, courtly love survived because it offered something sermons rarely did: emotional drama. People don't abandon theatre for lectures. The church slowed the fever, trimmed its excesses, but failed to excise the desire to desire. By the 14th century, a moralist still thundered, but troubadour DNA had already mingled with European culture. Cupid, slightly chastened, kept strumming, just softer, and with one wary eye on the pulpit. By the mid-14th century, the glitter on courtly love was flaking. Wars, plagues, and new money blurred the tidy hierarchies that had once made longing from afar feel fashionable. Knights were now hiring themselves out as mercenaries. Troubadours competed with itinerant jongleurs, and Europe's mood, ravaged by the Black Death, tilted from silk and sighs towards sackcloth and survival. Yet the old language of love did not vanish. It mutated into something subtler: courtesy. Courtesy books such as the Book of the Courtier, 1528 by Baldassare Castiglione, repackaged chivalric poses for Renaissance courts. Instead of bleeding under a lady's window, the polished courtier displayed sprezzatura, effortless grace, through dancing, witty banter, and lightly veiled admiration. Yearning remained, but desperation became gauche. Love was still a game. The rules simply swapped chainmail for velvet doublets. Literature mirrored the shift. Geoffrey Chaucer's Troilus and Cresside, c. 1385, presents lovers trapped between courtly ideals and brutal fate. Troilus worships with textbook devotion, yet politics and plague break the fantasy. Later in the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer pokes fun at knights whose rhetoric outshines their ethics, signalling that audiences now found equal pleasure in parody. Printing presses amplified change. Where hand-copied romances had circulated among elites, cheap chapbooks spread love templates to merchants and artisans. Ballads about the nut-brown maid or Sir Aldingar condensed centuries of chivalric angst into compact, hum-along tragedies. Love talk became mass culture, less refined, more democratic, and increasingly coloured by earthy humour. Meanwhile, real politics complicated flirtation. In France and Burgundy, courts of love mock tribunals where ladies judged amorous disputes gradually faded as central monarchies grew wary of aristocrats using romantic pageants to forge cliques. Kings preferred loyalty oaths over love oaths, yet vestiges endured. Tournaments kept awarding ladies favours. Young nobles still learned lute chords to serenade balconies. Heraldry manuals maintain that a knight might bear a heart aflame on his shield for a maiden's honor. Even the emerging genre of Valentine's Day poetry, first recorded in the 15th century, echoed courtly vocabulary of service, secrecy, and sweet pain. Thus courtly love never truly died. It shed its armor, slipped into silk, and strolled into the Renaissance disguised as refined etiquette. The dream of ennobling desire proved too intoxicating to abandon, so Europe rewrote the script, softening its tragedies and selling its tropes to every social stratum. Love was still a ritual. The stage sets just changed. Courtly love faded as a social practice, but its DNA threads through Western romance like gilt ink on vellum. When the Renaissance traded chainmail for satin, Petrarch and sonneteers simply recast the unattainable lady as Laura. And Shakespeare turned the trope inside out, making Juliet equal partner to her awestruck Romeo. The suffering silence ideal morphed into the grand gesture. Balcony speeches, secret letters, roses tossed beneath moonlit windows, medieval rituals in Elizabethan costume. The Enlightenment mocked chivalric excess, yet still prized sensibility, the sweet ache of unspoken longing. Jane Austen's heroines might scoff at knights, but Darcy's silent devotion to Elizabeth echoes Lancelot's mute adoration, only now tempered by moral accountability and mutual respect. Romantic-era poets cranked the pathos to 11. Byron's She Walks in Beauty would feel perfectly at home recited before a 12th-century duchess. Victorian etiquette manuals re-weaponized courtesy. Calling cards, chaperone dances, even the language of flowers all owe debts to medieval symbolism. Tokens signifying devotion while maintaining the fiction of restraint. When the industrial city replaced the castle, love still required choreography, and society still judged lovers by their mastery of coded signals. Cinema inherited the pageant. Silent film swashbucklers wooed damsels with swordplay and soulful stares. Hollywood's golden age polished the archetype into tuxedos and ballroom gowns. Every rom-com that hinges on a single kiss after 90 minutes of tension is reenacting the central premise of courtly love. Anticipation is sweeter than consummation. Even superhero sagas keep the flame alive. Think of Spider-Man swinging across skyscrapers just to leave a rose for Mary Jane. The battlefield changed, not the devotion. Digital culture, paradoxically, revives the medieval distance. Online fandoms idolize celebrities they will never meet, composing fan fiction as troubadours once composed Kansas. Emoji hearts and reaction gifts replace lute chords. Yet the dynamic is identical: exalted beloved, yearning admirer, endless scroll of unfulfilled desire. Meanwhile, shipping wars mirror tournaments of old, minus the lances. Critics call these patterns artificial, even toxic, and they can be. Courtly love always balanced on the edge of obsession, yet its endurance proves humans still crave narrative frameworks for passion, rules, quests, symbols, drama. We may say we want realistic love, but ticket sales suggest otherwise. The dream persists because it flatters both emotion and imagination.